for joining us tonight. So to get us started, I'm going to ask a little icebreaker question. It's going to be a bit more personal, so we can also get to know each other. So, given the theme of tonight, was there for each of you ever a time in your grad student or undergrad life when you felt like you and your work needed a stronger sense of purpose? Or did you always feel like you knew what your purpose was and that was something you knew since you were a child and you just pursued it for your whole life? So if you would like to share a bit of your journeys and maybe with paying attention to what you think is more personal to you and also what you think could be a lesson that can be useful to all of us. Maybe we can start with Peter.
Yeah, good evening everyone, and it's such an honor to be here at the University of Chicago. I think about this place as such a rich intellectual place, and I almost twice came here. First as an undergrad and as a grad student, so it's an honor to be back here as a faculty member visiting with you. And thanks to the Veritas team for organizing this. I sat where many of you sat as a student in some of these fora where I was wrestling with many of the same questions that you're wrestling with about faith, about truth, about what it means to have a meaningful life. As Elisa mentioned, I grew up in the Bahamas, and my mom's here in the audience from the Bahamas too, and so you can fact check everything I say with her. And we grew up selling fruits and vegetables in the straw market, and so I really got a deep understanding of how markets worked by us having to take produce from our farm or to buy produce from some of the local wholesalers and then resell those things. And so when recessions hit, we knew what that was like, what that meant for our profit margins. And I can think about maybe two discrete moments that gave me that sense of purpose. One was, I was 13 years old, and in our family, we had a strong tradition on reading. So we'd wake up at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, and then we would read the Bible, pray together as a family, and then we would go out and get the 3 local newspapers, and they would be spread out over the table, and we would read the newspapers for about an hour. And because I have 6 older brothers, there was a hierarchy, and the eldest brothers got to choose which sections they got to read first. And so the eldest brothers would choose the sports section first because that was the most interesting. And then you would get the national section, and then the international section, and then the business section was the most boring. And so I would be the one that's reading that first. And at the time, this was circa 1998, I'm much older than I look. The person who was our secretary for the Treasury, he said something really curious, which was the Bahamas shouldn't have an economy that's based on several pillars. At the time it was banking and finance, it was tourism and agriculture. He said, we should just focus on tourism. And I remember thinking as a 13-year-old kid, this seems wrong to me. Why would you only want to have one stream of revenue? And I said to myself, well, if I can see this as a 13-year-old kid, the Bahamas is in trouble. We really need economists in this country. And so I kind of felt like Peter Parker, where it was more from a sense of responsibility that seed was planted. And when I went to high school, I fell in love with physics. And I thought, oh my God, I absolutely must do physics, even if I don't do anything with this in my life, because it's so fascinating in terms of thinking about the world. And so as a 6-year-old kid, I said, how am I going to meld these two things together? And I said, you know what, I'm going to do theoretical economic modeling. I'll study physics so I can understand how to make models, because at the time I didn't know that economists also made models, so I'm sorry for my ignorance. And then I'll study economics because I want to make models about economics. And so I remember, and I'll wrap up in just a second, going to one of my uncles, and I said, before I went off to school in the US, and my uncle said, Peter, what are you going to major in? And I said, I'm going to do theoretical economic modeling. And he says, you want to be a model? You're like 5'7". I don't think that's going to work out. So that's a bit of my story. It was really about seeing a need in the world that I could identify because I was working in the marketplace, and then thinking, well, if I'm seeing this, then why not me? Why shouldn't I be someone who would stand in the gap? And my trajectory went through grad school in physics and then grad school in economics. And so it was a bit of a long, winding journey, but here I am today.
Great, yeah, thanks so much for sharing. And I guess now it's Pablo's your turn.
Yeah, so thanks for the invitation. Thanks for being here. It's an honor. You mentioned the word, Peter, you mentioned the word wrestling. And that brought to mind that I believe the last time that I was in this very same stage, I was wearing a lucha libre mask, ties, and no shirt. It was a skit show. This was a few moons ago, so that's kind of like a very special moment in my life. That's not what I'm gonna. I could say that, but I'm not gonna say that. What I'm gonna say is that one of the most important moments when I was a graduate student here was well, there's a sequence of events. Gary Becker I was his teaching assistant, and I came up with an idea, and I said he knew that I loved the movies. So I said, I think I've noticed a pattern in how people sit when they go to the movies, and I want to test it. And he was the most patient listener that you can imagine when it comes to grad student ideas. So he said, what do you need? And I said, well, I need to pay people to record how people sit. I cannot use a tape recorder, a camera, and videotape how people sit, because the Institutional Review Board, the authority that at the university decides what's ethical or not when it comes to research, they wouldn't allow me to film people in the movies. So I can, recruit students so that they can mark. I have a system and all device, but I need to pay them, and I'm a grad student, I don't have money. And I said, how much do you need? He bankrolled the project. And then he was very patient, and I collected the data, analyzed it, it came to him, and showed him the results. They confirmed with my theory, it was fantastic, I was very happy. And he said, so what's the relevance of the results? What's the relevance of the results? And I couldn't find any good reason to pursue that project on a larger scale. And I was like waving, and I was so happy, and he shut down the project in the most elegant way, which is, he let me do it. He put money for me to be able to carry out the project, and then in the end I learned the big question. Why, in which way what I'm doing is relevant, like really relevant, not just for me, for my fun, for my career, but is this something that matters? And since that day I asked, every time I do something, professionally or otherwise, why does this matter? Why is this relevant? So, thank you, Gary Becker.
All right, I see. So there's a lot of material here. It seems like you shared about moments when you thought, well, maybe I need to step in. I see a need, and I need to step in and play my part. Or like you mentioned, moments when a role model kind of like inspired you to be more like them, and in a way like to start questioning about the relevance of your work. But so, okay, I have some follow-up questions for you. So I guess to Pete, I would ask, how did that moment, that was kind of the initial moment when you felt your sense of purpose, how did that accompany you throughout the journey? So was it something that kind of stayed, or was it something that like you had to rekindle at some point? Did you ever question it?
Yeah, it's a good question. And for many of you here in the audience, let me just ask this question. How many of you feel that there's something that you observe in the world that is wrong with the world, and you feel that you see it very clearly and maybe in a way that others don't? If you do, like, just raise your hand. Yeah. And keep your hands raised if you feel a sense of conviction that you actually want to do something about it. Yeah. So it is those moments, right? And I think for me, that part of me became dormant for a while for a couple of reasons. One was I just absolutely fell in love with physics. So with physics, it wasn't this sense of responsibility. It was just like, I just want to be an artist and paint. I don't know why it's relevant, but I can understand the world around me. Whereas with economics, it felt like this sense of obligation, this sense of responsibility. And when I so I started off at a community college, a 2-year college in the Bahamas, and I did all the physics classes that I could do. And I came to the US because I couldn't do any more physics classes in the Bahamas. And when I came to the US, I said, I want to do theoretical economic modeling. And they're like, what is that? Like, who's going to fund you to do that? Nobody's doing this. And so then I had to make a decision. It was like, okay, I could do economics, but at the time, economics at Duke was a lot more focused on getting people into Wall Street. And I knew that I wanted to do something that was going to be a lot more connected to policy. And so I deferred that dream and I just focused in on physics and fell in love with physics even more deeply, and then found myself going to pursue a PhD in physics at Harvard. And it was during my second year of doing the PhD that I was sitting in a statistical mechanics course, and we were looking at a model of quantum magnetism where, if you've played chess before, the way that you can think about this magnetic system is on each of the squares you have an electron that can either be pointed up or down. There's this quantum number called spin. And the electrons want to all be aligned in the same direction, but there are some situations where you can have what's called a frustrated magnetic system, where in one half of the board, all of the electrons are pointing up, and on the other half, all of them are pointing down. And you have what's called a domain wall separating them. And I had this epiphany. I thought, this looks a lot like segregation. If you think about the electrons as being like encoding race, and maybe up could be encoding minority status and down non-minority status, you have this other side of the tracks phenomenon. Could you use this model to study residential segregation? And so I would stay up after midnight, after I'd done all my physics homework, and then I would be looking at economics papers and trying to adapt this model to economics. And that's when I stumbled on the work of Steve Durloff, who's here at the University of Chicago, and he had actually written a paper that was adapting this physics model to study segregation. And I thought, this is kind of cool. Like, I can use these motivations from physics to think about social questions. And in that moment, it was really terrifying for me, because here I am in a PhD program at Harvard, and I'll poke a tiny little bit of fun at my alma mater, which is like, when I had gotten the admissions letter from Harvard, it was like, congratulations, you've gotten into Harvard, it's like an amazing PhD program, and you should be so proud of yourself, and blah, 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 like a very Harvard letter, right? And I'm thinking, how am I gonna say to them now that I want to do economics when I've taken this spot for physics? And I was terrified. I was really, really terrified to pursue that passion. And what happened was, one of the administrators in my department one day, she came to me and she said, "Peter, you look terrible." She's like, "What's wrong with you?" And she was like a mom figure. Her name is Sheila Ferguson. And I just confessed to her the sense of kind of wrestling that I felt. And it was something that I had really been praying about a lot and sharing with my family and with really close friends. And she said, "Well, why don't you just pursue economics? Like, why don't you just talk to some people and just talk to the department chair and see if they will let you do this?" And once I overcame that fear, I was given the opportunity to take economics classes, to explore this passion a bit more. And then there was this moment of faith where I had to decide, do I stay in the PhD program in physics at Harvard, or do I switch and go to economics at the University of Pennsylvania? And that was a moment where, you know, for those of you who are raising your hands, when you think about there's something in the world that you see that you want to change or you want to impact, well, then there's a cost that comes with that. And up until that point, I had a very long and distinguished track record as a physicist. I had won the Barry Goldwater Scholarship in physics. I had like all of these accomplishments in physics, and so much of my identity was wrapped in being a physicist. I could see my career mapped out being a physicist, and it was like, would I walk away from this, right? And also would I walk away from being at Harvard? Because many times we're in places where the institution itself is such a big name and it's such an idol in the eyes of the world that we can pursue prestige over purpose. And I had a moment where, as I was praying, I said, you know what, like, even if my life ends up being obscure, I prefer to pursue a life of purpose rather than a life of prestige. And I took the leap and went to grad school in economics and started over again as a first-year student at the grandpa age of 25. But that moment was a really important moment for me. And there were many people who didn't understand that. They thought, why would you leave Harvard? Why would you start a PhD again? You're making a mistake professionally. But I knew that if I didn't act in faith and make that jump, I would be regretting that decision to act on something that I felt a strong sense of calling and purpose to do. And, you know, here I am many years later, you know, back at where I started now as a professor, and I get to share this story with you, and I hope that it resonates with you in a meaningful way as we think about the cost, not just the calling to do something that is meaningful and purposeful, but that calling comes with a cost. And you have to ask yourself the question, am I willing to pay the cost in order to fulfill the calling that's on my life?
that was an amazing story. Sounds like you had, your initial calling, and then you felt you had to go through a lot of difficulties, like finding the means to pursue the calling, and then like taking the leap and like giving up something to pursue the calling. But it also sounds like along the way you kind of had some breadcrumbs that were like just things that popped up in your life that somehow like reinforced your belief that you were on the right path.
Yeah, I mean, definitely there were moments and times, and there are also like moments of great difficulty. Like there was one point where I was wrestling with this so much. Like I just was like, I hope they kick me out of graduate school, right? Because I didn't want to just like leave, right, and change fields, because it was like I did feel that I was supposed to go and finish this PhD in physics, but then I also felt this sense of like, well, I also want to do economics, right? And I was wrestling with this so much, and I think in a lot of these critical moments, and I'm a person of faith, I'm a Christian, and I believe that in many of these critical moments that God sent people into my life who were able to see even on my face that I was wrestling with something when I didn't want to share that. Because I think for many of you in this room too, you're here at the University of Chicago or Northwestern because you've been excellent at what you've done. You probably are the person in your family or in your friend group who holds things together. And so when you struggle, it can be hard to admit that to yourself or to other people and to seek help. And you can just kind of struggle like very quietly. And I'm so grateful that there were people in my life like Sheila Ferguson or like my friend Raphael Luna who came and they saw me in those moments of struggle, and they could just see on my face that I was going through something. And they could challenge me to say, why wouldn't you take that leap of faith and see if God wouldn't meet you there, right? And I hope for each of you that you have those people, those angels that in your moment of crisis can recognize the difficulty. And I hope too that you have the courage to like listen to those voices and take just that next step and to see what's on the other side of it.
Right, so thank you so much, Pete. Now I would like to turn it to Pablo. So I have a specific follow-up question to your intro. So you said that Gary Becker was kind of the first person really to push you to think, so what is the purpose of all of this that I'm doing? Is it just like trying to pursue academic success or just having fun, or does it have some other purpose? So then I'm going to ask you, what is then a question that has purpose, or like a question that is worth pursuing, or like what was your conclusion? And a bit like Pete did, I would like you, if you want to tell us a bit when you're thinking about purpose, is it only about kind of the long-term product of your work that matters to you? Or is it also important for your sense of purpose, just like what you learn along the way through the daily experience of difficulties and facing those difficulties, or just like all you learn through the process?
Thank you. Well, it's a great question. Let me start with an anecdote that involves a colleague that I appreciate a lot, a friend from a long time ago, another economist. And after not seeing this person for a while, we crossed paths, and he's an incredibly successful economist in academia. And we have his family over, and I was telling him that my brother has passed away not too long ago, I think maybe the year prior. And he asked me a question that really took me by surprise. He asked me, was he successful? And it took me a while to understand the question. And I had to ask back, what do you mean by... I mean, it's not the first thing that comes to my mind when somebody tells me that a loved one passed. And I said, successful how? And this person explained, professionally, what did he do for a living? And And I said, he was a car mechanic and a DJ on the weekends. That's what he did. He did not make a lot of money, barely any money. So no, he was not successful in that sense. But he had a lot of friends who loved him. I was there at his funeral, and I saw lines of people that just wanted to say goodbye and came to me. There was this individual who came to me to give me the equivalent of $10 or $20 because he said, I owe this money to your brother, and I want to make sure that this debt is covered. But it was a gesture, I think, of appreciation more than anything else. So at that point, I mean, this person that I'm talking about is incredibly smart, incredibly successful. I wouldn't be surprised at all if he's awarded a Nobel Prize or something. But to me, it came as a shock. It really shook me. And then after that, I thought, to what extent am I thinking of success the same way? So there's a very interesting allegory of David Brooks about curriculum virtues and eulogy virtues. And when somebody dies, people don't recite how many papers you published or how many awards you got at your job or at work. Or seriously, people focus on he was a great human being, a great friend, generous soul, was there when you need them, etc. So that really was the moment where, talking about this idea of purpose, we want to have success. The question is, how do we define success? Can we define it ourselves? And I think that's a conscious process. We choose what we call success. We choose how we see that path. And going back to what you do for a living, you have to connect those two. You cannot say, I want to have success as a person, as a whole human being, and then act on your job like you don't care about that. So I think it's a struggle, it's a continuous process. You have to work on it. It's like gymnastics or yoga or whatever. If you do something, you have to practice it every day to get better at it and keep doing it. Otherwise, you lose that ability. So I don't know if that answers in any way the question.
Well, it does to some extent, of course. You didn't tell us what you think is the secret sauce to write a successful and impactful paper in economics, but maybe we can have that conversation another time. But no, you did tell us that there are a lot of things that go into making a sense of purpose for you that are not really measurable things, and they're not even long-term objectives. They are not part of the process. So how your job can bring you to be there for people, how your job can bring you to try and give your best every day. So these are all kind of like maybe not distant long-term goals, and they're not like measurable achievements, but they do make a big part of your sense of purpose. So I guess this takes us to another topic that I would like us to discuss, which is I think also part of our technological mindset, part of the technical innovations that we had have made us very good at measuring everything. And so that kind of brings in a temptation to assign ourselves tasks and kind of evaluate our performance on these tasks in a measurable way. But it's not necessarily the case that the objectives that are easier to measure are actually the objectives that are worth pursuing. So some easy to measure objective could be how long you have worked, or like how many citations your work got, or like how prestigious is your institution. But maybe even though these are easy to measure, they might not be the best objective to pursue. So I wanted to ask each of you, did you ever feel like you were pressured to perform in some of these measurable dimensions, and how did that impact your journey? And do you think that instead we can put to good use this ability that we have to quantify things?
I can jump in on that. How many people here are economists? All right, sciences, engineering, computer science, humanities. All right, so we got a nice mix of a crowd, and I'll meld this into with the question around like how do you think about a successful paper too. And I'm really struck by that story, that you shared, Pablo. And the sad thing is, like, I'm not surprised that many people within the economics profession have that perspective, because I was a physicist before I was an economist. And the thing that struck me was just how much people measure things in economics. I remember when I was on the job market. The job market is like your last year of your PhD. It's this incredibly public process, and people who don't even know you would say, like, so Peter, like, how many jobs did you apply to? How many first round interviews do you have? Like, do you fly out? It's like, which job are you gonna take? And I'm like, I don't know you. Like, why are you asking me all of my business? And like nowadays, it's public. It's on econ job rumors, and it's like people talk about a lot of things about you. There was this rumor once that like Peter Blair's being recruited by the University of Chicago, and it was like all of this like stuff, and I was just like, this is not true. You just see people lying about you. It's wild. It's just absolutely wild. So yeah. Anyway, but this question around, like, it was like, how do you deal with like measuring, like this constant need to measure things? How do you think about value apart from that? Coming back to this question of calling in class, it cost me a lot to be an economist. Like, I left doing physics. I was working for the person at the time who was the most cited theoretical physicist in the world. Like, she was just an amazing physicist, and I left that to start from scratch. And my entry into economics was actually pretty bad. Like, my first semester, I think I got like 2 B pluses and like a C plus in one of my classes. It was like really bad. And I was like, my God, the last time I got a C was like in 8th grade when I got a D in religion. That teacher really hated me though. I mean, I don't know if she hated me, but like, it was weird. I got like a D in my coursework, but I got like a 98 on the test, and I was like, this is the most weird thing ever. And so it was like this very inauspicious kind of like start, and I was like, oh my God, did I like make a mistake? And at the time, I was doing research as I was studying for my classes, and some people thought, well, maybe this is why your grades are so terrible. It's because you're doing research. You should just focus on your classes. And the research that I was doing was about economic development in the Bahamas and whether protecting property rights would lead to economic growth. And this was something that was a really fundamental question in my mind, and something that drove me to think about economics as a pursuit. And I was told, why are you studying economics? And like, why are you studying the economics of the Caribbean? And like, why are you going to conferences with Caribbean economists? Like, is there going to be anyone from Chicago or Harvard or Stanford there? And these measurable things. And I said, well, no, but because this project is about the Caribbean, I want to hear what people from the Caribbean think about this. And there is a Nobel Prize winning economist from the Caribbean, so Arthur Lewis. So kind of great people come from that region too. And I've constantly found myself in the profession being drawn to questions that initially people thought were unimportant. I started working on occupational licensing about 6 years ago. The short version of it is there are many jobs for which you need to have a license in order to work legally for pay in that occupation. So doctors, lawyers, in a lot of cases, people who work in plumbing, electrical work, carpentry. And when I started working on licensing, I was told by a very senior economist, Peter, this is a dead field. We know everything there is to know from Milton Friedman's 1961 book. This is a dead field, don't do it. And I thought, yeah, but I think that this is important because as someone who recognizes the existence of labor market discrimination, which is something that Gary Becker studied and formalized, that having a credential could help you to overcome that discrimination. If Mark Zuckerberg walks into a room with a hoodie, they're like, he's disrupting like the tech sector. If I walk in with a hoodie, it's like, is he gonna rob me? Right? And that's a real thing. And so like, for folks who might otherwise face labor market discrimination, having those signals can matter a lot. And so in spite of advice from a very well-meaning and brilliant senior colleague, I started doing this research on licensing because I thought it was important for people to have access to credentials. And the headline is I found that licensing reduced racial and gender wage gaps, particularly because for Black men it was a signal of non-felony status. And probably like 5 years after I did that project, licensing became a really hot topic. Obama was thinking about licensing reform, Trump, Biden, bipartisan support, and the work that we did was covered in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, all of these other things. And that same economist came back to me many years later and said, Peter, licensing is a really important topic. I know that you've written some of the seminal papers in licensing. Please tell me what other papers I should be reading of yours and of others. And so that senior colleague made a flip in their mind around the importance of this work. But I knew that that was an important topic because my own lived experience taught me that having credentials matter for people who might otherwise face discrimination. And many of the topics that I've done in my career have been ahead of their time, and I've not been encouraged to do those things because either it was a dead field or other people weren't thinking about it. And it's required for me to have a lot of courage to pursue things that other people thought was not important. And you know what I said to folks? I said, I spent 9 years at graduate school, 4 years at Harvard, 5 years at Wharton to get this PhD. Now that I have this PhD, I'm going to do the things that I think are important because I don't get paid enough for somebody else to tell me what to do. I was like, in order for someone to tell me what to do, I need to be making Wall Street money. And so, I don't know any, in a sense, because I paid the cost of pursuing this calling in economics, it's given me a lot of freedom and confidence to work on the questions that I think matter a lot for society. And I've seen in the long run where that's mattered. But to be honest with you, in the short run, there have been times where it has been lonely. There have been times when people have looked at me and thought, is your career really on the right track? Are you really focusing on the right questions? And sometimes you have to be willing to be out of equilibrium with the profession in order to make a really big mark that shifts the way that people think about which topics are important.
All right, thank you, Pete. So that resonates a lot with all the anxiety about starting a project and how do you find something that's important. One thing I say a lot to students is just look at papers, and if you see a paper with an abstract that you think is very interesting, but then after reading the paper you're like, it didn't really answer my question, then maybe that's your question. That's what you wanted to study, so that seems very similar to your experience. Pablo, how about your own journey? Did you ever have a time when you felt that what you thought was your true calling was at odds maybe with what those measurable rewards are, or what other people around you thought you should be doing, and how did you go about this?
I think I wanted to be an economist since I was 12 years old, and that's because 1987, which is the year I was 12, Mexico was experiencing hyperinflation. So there was stuff that I wanted that I could see the price go up every week. At the same time, the little money that I was making, I was changing it immediately to dollars. And I couldn't understand why people were selling real assets to put their money in the bank. Nominal rates were super high, so it was a mess. So I said, I want to understand what's happening. And then, obviously, it was not a straight line. It was more like a zigzag. But I'm still in love with economics, so I was very lucky to find the path found me, I would say. So, in that sense, I've tried my hand at private sector, public sector, not-for-profit, and now in academia, and I love every bit of it. And I don't want to give up any of that, so I try to, be doing lots of things, not necessarily at the same time, but alternating, and it's just to me very fulfilling. I found my sense of purpose there. I love teaching. I love awakening curiosity for economics in young minds, showing them that this can be fun, that it matters, and I know that sometimes there are pendulums that swing, and right now I think we're in a situation where the access to data that we were mentioning before, measurable things, has taken us to a specific place. And Noah, if you can put the slide that I prepared. I wasn't prepared, but so this is a cartoon that appeared not long ago, a couple of weeks ago in the New Yorker, And I don't know if you can see it, but that's the guy who didn't know his cholesterol, his BMI, his net worth, his IQ, his credit score, his blah, 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 blah. And he's walking, not minding anything. And I think there's a little bit of a lesson there. Too much information can be a problem, can be a burden. Obsessing about some indicators may be a problem. Sometimes we're better off when we do not know some things. Now, I'm not claiming that ignorance is bliss, but I'm saying that there are numbers that you can live without knowing. There's something in psychology called reference bias. I don't know if anybody raised their hands when you mentioned psychology, or you didn't mention psychology, but it affects us. What we perceive to be around us has an effect on our subjective well-being. So one has to be careful as to what to look at. But I love the idea of measuring. I'm a fan of measuring. The question is always, what do we measure? So if you can show the second slide, I don't know how many of you can guess what's on screen. Any guesses? It's a scene from a famous TV show. You know what that is?
Breaking Bad.
Breaking Bad. It's one of the last scenes of Breaking Bad. And he's telling the couple over there to give that cash to his children without telling them that it's from him, because the children think he's a monster, a criminal, a murderer. Okay? And I love watching shows and movies because I cannot avoid sort of like thinking as a moral philosopher or a political economist, that they used to call them, different ages, right? They used to be moral philosophers, then political economists. Now it's an extinct species. Economists now do other things, but that's not my point here. Is what I see there is the following: you can leave a ton of money to your children. Maybe you don't have children, but it's a hypothetical. Say, I think that was like 10 million, 20 million, a big amount. But they're gonna believe you're a monster, a criminal, a murderer. How much of that money you're willing to sacrifice if they know the truth, that you're not that kind of monster? You don't have to answer the question, but it's a great measurement of something. Willingness to pay for them to see you in a particular way once you're gone. It's a very interesting exercise, because I think most people would say, no, I don't want my children to have that image of me. Even if I'm going to be dead, I want them to remember me, to think that I was a good person, or to know that I was a good person. That's a number. That's a way to measure something. Now, it might not be the most relevant thing, but I think it tells you how much you care about how other people perceive you for your parents. Adam Smith talked about wanting praise, but also praiseworthiness, deserving that praise. The so-called impartial spectator. We know we can judge ourselves, and we want to be judged correctly, especially by our loved ones. You can show the second one, just one more exercise. That, ladies and gentlemen, it's a penthouse in the Gold Coast here in Chicago. It's a villa at the top of a building on Lakeshore Drive. It can be yours for $25 million. You can find images, it's fantastic. I mean, it's in front of Lakeshore Drive. You can see the lake from your villa. That's real grass. I haven't been there, but I looked like carefully at the pictures. Now, here's the exercise. Imagine that I offer you, or somebody offers you the deal. That can be yours. There's a masseuse, a cook, everything, a sommelier, best food, everything you can imagine. But there's a catch. If you use it, you have to use it by yourself. When you're there, the food's going to be there, but you're not going to see a human being. You cannot bring friends, loved ones, anything. So it's a fantastic place with everything that you can consume, except that you cannot even talk about it or TikTok about it. Right? I know what you're thinking. It's not fun. The fun is to do it with other people, to talk about it, to communicate with other people. That highlights the importance of relationships. Consumption without relationships is nothing, or barely anything. Now, what's the number? The magic number is, imagine that I tell you, how many days of a year are you willing to sacrifice in that beautiful place in order to bring a loved one, or 2 or 3 or 4, or be able to talk about it? I don't want to know the real number, but the point is, that is another number, another metric, but it's a metric of something important. We don't think about it. We actually do things to spend time with other people, with loved ones, or even not with loved ones, with people we have familiarity with. So I think measuring is not wrong. Why do we want to measure and why is what matters? And I think I pick these weird metrics, but I think they tell us something important about us. And lastly, I know there was a question that somebody posed among the audience about standardized tests. I know we can talk a lot about that, but standardized tests get a bad rap, but they were invented 102 years ago in Northumberland, in England, by a great man who thought it was unfair to give regular knowledge tests to kids, to give them access to secondary school there. Back then it was a privilege, because only the kids from rich or good families would get spots at those institutions. So he said, there's got to be a way to do this. So he was a physicist, I believe. His name is Gottfried Thomson. And he said, there's got to, he invented the field of psychometrics. He started to create intelligence tests that later were given to millions of people in the UK. So the goal was to make things fair. So now people obsess and it's like, well, we shouldn't have SAT, we shouldn't have test scores. Well, there's another person I'm going to cite, and then I'm going to stay quiet for a bit. Another economist, Joseph Schumpeter, said, if we don't know the history of what we're analyzing, of our analytical framework, then we're missing out a lot of stuff. Because what we have now carries the scars of the problems from the past. And I think a prime example is standardized testing. If we look at it today, we can find a lot of problems with it. But we shouldn't forget where it was coming from. It was created primarily to make things just, or at least a little more just.
All right, so thank you so much, Pablo. I think we're about at the time when we should start our Q&A, but just to wrap us up, I wanted to underscore a couple points from what you said, Pablo. So I really like your point about sharing with others, and if I think through my life, I totally agree that sharing with friends increased a lot my sense of purpose in my work, and also listening to my friends' feedback really kind of helped figuring out what my calling was. So I really like your point. And related to the measurement that you were talking about, following up from questions that some of you posted, I wanted to ask briefly if you have thoughts. What do you think is the role of economics in defining the value of work? So as economists, we talk a lot about value, like figuring out what the price of thing is. But I think here are two ways that one could think about it. Like economics just actually is sufficient by itself as a discipline to just give us an answer, or like the question could be more in the realm of philosophy. And kind of thinking along those lines, we could think of economics as like a tool to somehow help us elicit what is the value that we attach to things such as our work, and like help us based on our value system, help us to make decisions and make predictions. So how much do you view economics as sufficient, or like more as a tool to understand and act upon our values that are determined outside of economics?
I can jump in that. So I came to economics like relatively late, and I had done physics for a really long time. And so I remember taking microeconomics from my colleague Chris Avery at Harvard. And the first couple of months, I would sprawl in the margins of my book, because I grew up in the British system, we'd have margins. I was like, economists believe this. This is crazy. This makes no sense. and it was wild because there are just so many assumptions that we make. So, for example, one of the things that I tackle a lot in my research is the notion of what does it mean for a worker to be skilled? Because in economics, we say that the wage equals the marginal product of labor, right? And definitionally, in economics, we call a worker skilled if they have a college degree, and someone is unskilled if they don't. And that has huge normative implications, because if you think about, for each of you in the room, like how many of you know someone who does not have a college degree, but who's just a tremendously skilled person? Maybe they took care of you when you were a kid, or they're like a super wise person, right? And it's like many of you in the room know that, right? I have 3 brothers who've not completed college, but they're brilliant. And so a lot of my work has been around how do we recognize the fact that people gain skills through their work experience. And this is something that Gary Becker, in his seminal paper, the JP, that looked at education as human capital, focused on. He really said, like, it's about on-the-job training. And somehow in the profession, we lost sight of the fact that people gain skills through the act of working itself. And a big part of my work has been around restating that point and making the argument that people gain work through their work experience and their skill through alternative routes, and we call them stars. And in the profession, we've gotten a lot of pushback from that, right? Because it's like, well, how are you going to call somebody who's unskilled a star, skilled through alternative routes? That's a normative statement. I'm like, yeah, it is normative. In the same way that calling them unskilled is really normative too. And so I would say that I see economics as a tool, but I believe that we ought to have a set of values, and we ought to see economics as being a tool for helping us to advance those values. Because as economists, and I think you might agree with this, Lisa, we are trained not to be normative. We are trained to be positive and say, well, if you do this, then that will happen. We're not trained to say, you should do this. And in part because we're not trained to do that, I think oftentimes we can take the status quo as being neutral, when in fact the status quo is carrying, I think it's, what you mentioned, Pablo, is it's carrying the scars of the past. And sometimes the scars are good, and sometimes those scars kind of reinforce certain ideas that can be difficult and painful.
Yeah, I mean, broadly agree. I would say we don't need to be necessarily just positive, but like we take as an input what the desirable objective is. So yeah, I would agree that economics doesn't have itself a tool to say what's desirable, but it does take as given what people think is desirable. So in that sense, one could also do normative. But yeah, so anyway, Pablo, would you like to add anything before we open it up to Q&A?
Just quickly, I absolutely think that economics has a lot to say, and it can be interesting at a personal level. It doesn't have to be all just for policy making. I think the exhibits that I presented are sort of like there's a lot of introspection there to see what's the most precious thing in your life, what you value the most. And if you read old authors, from the 19th century, early 20th century, economists, they talk a lot about this. I mean, they're not cynical at all. So I think economics can help because it's all about trade-offs. And we have to trade. I was reading an article yesterday in the Wall Street Journal about a lot of young people deliberately quitting very well-paid jobs to take jobs with a 30%, 40% pay cut to have more time, to enjoy life better. And to me, I use those examples when I teach economics. Those are beautiful poetic applications of what we understand conceptually as economists. So I think that is incredibly important. And last but not least, I'm going to cite again Schumpeter because I read it over the break. Sorry. He's very clear in a passage where he explains economics has 2 roots: philosophy and practical life. And that's how it was founded. And the beauty of this is it's philosophy applied to the day-to-day questions. Should I retire? Should I quit this job or not? But the question is philosophical. It's what do you care about? Why? What's the purpose of your job, of your earning money, of having a family, having children? So it's the practical combined with the philosophical in so like the best expression.
I think these are two great points. Like I would say one point was economics doesn't just take as given what we state our values, but it also can help us elicit what those values are. Like you showed us with the villa and the money, the state example. But yeah, so well, thank you so much to both of you, and now let's maybe open it up for the Q&A.
Peter, not to pick on semantics, but there's one thing early that you said when your colleague or your mentor ahead of you recognized that you were in distraught, and you used the word crisis. And I was kind of intrigued by that word, which I know that often we feel that, but I think as we reconcile calling those things, I'm kind of curious on your use of that word, because I think you can feel that way, but I don't think that's necessarily the message you're trying to portray. So I don't know if that's enough to prompt you.
Yeah, no, that's good. Before you leave, I'd love to hear what would be some words that you might use differently, because I think that could be helpful.
Yeah, and I say this now because I'm in my 40s, I have 2 young kids, right? And I think as these students here and your teen years and your 20, as you're in college, it's hard. Life is very uncertain, right? You're trying to forge that path. And so, to me, I guess I'm trying to normalize it.
I see. So like a part of the development process.
And I think your crisis was maybe you were already down a path that was, you thought, too far to course correct on what things that, I don't know, that word just stuck out to me.
I appreciate that, and I think it speaks to this like broader theme of the social psychologist at NYU, Jonathan Haidt, I think that's how you say his last name. He has been talking a lot about to what extent are the youth of today coddled. And for those of you young people, you probably hear that a lot, like the older generation. In my day, things are really hard, and everyone's saying they have a mental health crisis or this is happening, and I've been turning that over in my mind a bit, and I think that this might be related to that question, which is to what extent does the stresses that we feel at these stages, how much of that is just part of the developmental process, and how much of that is generally something that's really difficult. And I have 2 maybe conflicting perspectives on it. On the one hand, there are ways in which we do have first world problems, right? We are students at the University of Chicago. Even if everything goes sideways for you, you're gonna be fine, right? But then at the same time too, because you're students at the University of Chicago, we have to condition on the fact that you're at Chicago, and condition on being at Chicago, what you experience, it feels like a crisis, right? And I think that those 2 things are true, and we live in a society where, on the one hand, I think that for those of us who are so incredibly blessed and privileged, sometimes we can lose sight of our problems within a broader context. And I also think sometimes society can be very insensitive to the fact that we can actually have problems, even though our problems are very different. And in those moments when you've gotten to a place because you've been amazing at everything that you've done up until that point, and you reach something that's a difficult transition for you, it can be hard to figure out, what do I do in this situation where everything seems like it's falling apart, right? And you have to develop the skills and the competencies to cope with that. And for me, it's been really important as a person of faith to recognize that when I come to the end of myself, that's not the end, right? And that's where my faith in God becomes really important as a foundation. And so what I would say is you both have to develop a lot of resiliencies, and then at the same time too, if you are having a difficult time, don't feel like because your difficult time is about a grade at Chicago or because it's about a job, that's less valid. Yes, you're not starving on the street, but that's your problem. You just have a different set of problems. And so let's not invalidate that, but then at the same time too, let's put it into the broader context. I know that may sound a little bit like neither here nor there, but I do think it's valuable to weigh both of those.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like, whatever our circumstances, we will always find something difficult to accept. And so it's like part of everyone's journey to like accept and respond to that in the best way. So, and we see a lot of that in our, academic lives. Okay, so do we have more? Perfect.
Hi, first of all, thank you for organizing this forum and coming to speak with us. My question is, how in your careers have you kind of wrestled with anxiety or insecurity about what you're doing? And, oftentimes I think that we kind of all have this desire to know that we are doing the right thing or that we're going to be successful in what we're doing. But also the knowledge that there's so many things in our lives that we can't control. So I guess how have you approached this or struggled with this in your journeys and kind of maintained the desire that to want to know that you're doing the right thing, that you're on the right track, but also the humility in the sense that you might not be, or there are other things beyond your control.
That's a difficult question. So not everybody experiences anxiety or stress or crisis the same way. I think I've been lucky enough to not have had those episodes, or at least not in a terrible way. But I know people who have gone through that, and I don't think there's no single recipe. But all I can advise is, I don't want to trivialize it, but there's a video circulating online of an interviewer asking Bob Marley if he's rich. And Bob Marley answers right away, "What do you mean rich?" And he talks about money in the bank and possessions. And I love the line that follows after that, because Bob Marley asks back, "Possessions make you rich?" And the question is, after what we get stressed? What is the cause of that? Success, is that what is gonna make the feeling go away? Well, when you advance in your career, you start getting the sense that it's never enough. People at the top of any profession are still struggling to be even higher. And so, to me, if you can see it, you can be mindful about it and say, that's clearly, so let me put it this way. In their deathbed, not that I've been at the deathbed of many people, but I don't think people say, man, I wish I had spent more time writing that paper or trying to close that deal, or it's typically spending more time with my family. Be it their parents, their siblings, their children. What does that tell you? Rich, poor, whatever, they seem to gravitate towards the same topics. And if you look at the classic tragedies, the epics, or whatever literature, sort of like timeless literature, art, it's all about family and love. Country too. But I'm going to focus on family and love. So that's part of a conscious process, at least to me. You're always going to be, it's like when you're driving on Lakeshore Drive and somebody wants to pass you and you immediately get into a competition, right? It's very easy to get carried away because we love it. It's fun to compete. But then it can cause stress. So, yes, as long as you know that when you're watching your favorite team, the White Sox playing, and you're excited, and they bomb it again, then you're like, I took my kids to see the White Sox play at Wrigley Field, and we were excited, and they dropped it in the last swing, okay? So there was a big party in Wrigley Field, and the three of us are White Sox fans. And I had to sort of like cheer them on. We walked all the way home because we live on the north side. It's not such a long walk. But the point is, what is important? They were gone because of the Bears did. If you root for the Bears, you have to develop these skills. But the same happens with your career. It's never going to be enough. Nobody says, or not many people say, enough. I've made it. Once you made it there, it lasts a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks, and then it's again. I'm not going to be the one who lags behind. But if you say, what I care about are my relationships with your community, with your family, with your loved ones, then it's a different game. You're not in a competition with anybody. So I think, but that's again, it's a struggle. You have to keep doing it. It's not, you don't reach the level and then that's it. You keep working on that, I believe. That's my 50 cents or 5 cents. I don't know. $50.
I also meant like, thank you, that's a great answer. I was also curious more like, how do you deal with the tension between wanting to like control your life and wanting to have that sense of purpose, but also with the fact that you can't control everything. There's things outside of your control.
So maybe we can have Pete wrap us up, because I think we're almost out of time.
Yeah, thank you for that question. When I left the Bahamas, I went to Duke for undergrad, and when I graduated, I felt this sense of accomplishment, and I said something to my mom that may have surprised her, and I said, Mom, you know what, I reflected on my journey there. I was like, I would write a book about undergrad, and the title would be, I Could Have Gone Crazy 5 Times at Duke. Like, seriously. And there was just so much stress, and this makes me think about the first question too. And thank you for asking that question about crisis versus not. I had to maintain like at least a 3.5 GPA at Duke, and midterm for the first semester, I probably had like the equivalent of a 3.1 GPA. And so like I could have lost my scholarship in the first semester. And you know what happened? I picked up that transcript and I looked at this and I smiled and I laughed and I said, God, between you and me, this is the lowest my grades are ever going to be at Duke. And I just dismissed that piece of paper and I was like, this is not who I am. And I just went about my business, and at the end of that semester, I had like a 3.92 and I was ranked in the top 1 point whatever percent at Duke. And you may ask, well, Peter, how did that happen? And the year prior, I had to overcome so much. I had gotten the top scholarship in my nation, and then I lost it because I went to the community college in the country. So I lost a $100,000 scholarship. My grandmother passed at the beginning of the second semester in community college. My brother died in a fire accident 21 days later, and I saw his charred body like in the back of our yard. It was an accident. And he was the person that was the most influential intellectual mentor in my life. And so it was like I was in school, then my grandmother died, then I was in school, then my brother died. And then 3 months later, my best friend growing up got shot in the block that I grew up in, right? And he didn't finish high school. And so when I left the Bahamas and came to Duke, I had to overcome so much to get there. And I was like, God, you've brought me too far for me to like fail. And going through those fires gave me a sense of resilience. It also gave me a sense of purpose. And this for me is where my faith was really fortified a lot at Duke. And it wasn't something that I was expecting, because my mom, she wanted me to go to a Christian school. She wanted me to go to Oral Roberts University. And I was like, absolutely not, I'm not going there. And I was like, I need to find a clever way to like get out of this. And I was like, well, Mom, if all of the Christians go to the Christian schools, then who's going to tell the people at the secular schools about Jesus? And she's like, ooh, I didn't think about that. But I didn't expect to go to Duke and to like have my faith in Jesus be like further reinforced. But honestly, like a lot of those difficulties and those trials, they took me to the end of myself. They absolutely took me to the end of myself. It took me to the end of my intellect. It took me to the end of my money. There was a point in time where they were like, if you don't come up with this $12,000, we're going to kick you out of school. My mom didn't have the money. I didn't have the courage to ask her for that money. And those difficulties were good for me. And because I had overcome so much to get to that point too, it gave me a kind of a confidence, almost like an abandon, almost like a sense of even being like dead to some of these pressures, because I recognized that I had a life and I had a worth that was apart and outside of my academic experience at Duke. And one thing that I would say, and this might sound weird, is dying to self is a really important part of the process, because to the extent that you possess, and this comes back to what you were saying, Pablo, that you possess your degrees and your credentials and all of these things, they can possess you in very unhealthy ways. When you think that I just need to give more and more and more and more of myself, because your jobs are going to be greedy, your academics are going to be greedy, and if you think that the production function is just about your time and about your effort, you're going to give more and more of yourself to it. And the reality is, for each new level that you go to professionally, the responsibilities are just going to escalate. And so for me, it's been really important to recognize that I am not enough, right? And that's where my faith becomes really important, to have that divine inspiration. And also to be surrounded by a community of people who value me intrinsically, right? Like people who understand my worth, my work, and my worship. Because if your work is the totality of your identity, when things go sideways with your work, your life falls apart. And when your life falls apart, then it becomes so hard to come back from that. So make sure that your identity is not, that your worth is not completely determined by whether you're successful or not in your